Here, I discussed the different ways that people approach interpreting the book of Revelation, and I discussed how I approach the book of Revelation. But also I mentioned four different approaches: preterist, historicist, idealist, and futurist approaches to interpreting the book of Revelation. And I intended to actually get into Revelation chapter 11 last time, but I didn't, so that's what we're going to do now. We've kind of been stuck on this issue of John being told to measure the temple, the courtyards, etc. And so we're gonna work on that and include in that, hopefully get to the two witnesses which are connected somehow. Revelation chapter 11, then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple, leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, that they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours out from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky, so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. At that moment there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe has passed. The third woe is coming very soon. Okay, that last phrase, verse 14 there, the second woe has passed, the third woe is coming very soon, ties this back to the 7 trumpets, because we had the first 4 trumpets, then we were told there would be 3 woes that would follow. We got 2 more trumpets, and then we're in the intermission period, and now we're coming to the end of that intermission period, which is what verse 14 is telling us. But the measuring of the temple and this description of the 2 witnesses is part of that intermission, not the whole thing, but it is an important part of that intermission. So, what does the temple represent? And we will try to work through that given those various approaches to interpreting Revelation. And we will start with the preterist. Hopefully start with the marker that's legible. The preterist. That is the approach to Revelation that sees everything described in Revelation as having happened during the lifetime of the people to whom John is writing, or before that time. And so, from the perspective of John, everything is essentially in the past as that is being described here. And so then what would this be? Come measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple, leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. John is writing the book of Revelation somewhere around the year 96, somewhere in that time frame. Can't be more precise than that, although I have a CD recorded by the monks of the monastery of St. John on the island of Patmos, and it was recorded, I think, in 1995, and they were celebrating the 1,900th year after the writing of Revelation. So they figured out it's the year 95 somehow. But precisely when we don't know, but we know that's about right, 95, 96, something like that. We approach this from a preterist perspective, that what's being described here is something that has happened in the past, or no later than during the lifetime of the people to whom it is written. The most obvious connection would be the actual destruction of the temple by the Romans. The Jewish people had rebelled against the Roman Empire, and the Romans had come in and conquered Jerusalem. That took place in the year 70, so it would have been about 25, 26 years before the writing of Revelation. It's something about which the people to whom John was sending this would have known. My biggest obstacle to interpreting this as being some kind of reference to that is that, to me, it just really doesn't make any sense. Because what happened was the temple was completely demolished. The entire city was destroyed. The city became essentially uninhabitable. The holy place was destroyed. The Holy of Holies was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. And so the idea of the Gentiles trampling the outer courtyards, that would make sense. But it doesn't really make any sense of the court, the temple of God, and the altar, and those who worship there. Because this description John gets, this vision John has, seems to indicate, most people would interpret it at least, as indicating that that core would be protected. And when the Romans conquered Jerusalem, that most certainly did not happen. And so if we try to interpret this in a preterist sense, on the one hand, it's easy to connect it to the Roman conquering of Jerusalem, but on the other hand, it doesn't make any sense in terms of once you start looking more at the details. How would they have connected it? And I don't see a way to connect it. If someone has greater insight on that than I do, I'd be very glad to listen. But I don't know how you make this be a reference to the Roman destruction of the temple. So to me, that doesn't seem to work. The historicist approach. The historicist approach. Historicist approach sees the book of Revelation as giving us essentially the history of the church before any of it happened. The way I put it before, on the handout that I gave you last time, was the events presented in Revelation are a symbolic outline of the history of the church age. Okay? So what is this? And again, I don't really know. I can see the idea that the measuring of the temple and the altar and those who worship there is an indication that those who are faithful to God will be protected and preserved by God. And I would say that's definitely a characteristic of the church age. Then, verse 2, and it says, "Do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. That seems to be an indication of the powers of this world, the forces of evil in this world will seem at times to have authority. They will seem at times to threaten the very existence of the people of God. Well, I think that has been characteristic of the church age at various times. And so it's not that I can't see this passage as having any relevance to the history of the church, but I don't see a specific time during church history that this would apply. One of the one of the common characteristics we as human beings have is that we tend to view the situation we're in as the worst it's ever been, and it can't get any worse, and therefore if God's going to rescue us, it's bound to happen very, very soon. Sociologists and anthropologists have studied societies that had a view of history, and in their view of history, everything started off perfectly well, everything was fine, everything was good. But things have degenerated from that, gotten worse, and eventually it's going to get completely awful, and then something revolutionary will happen that will overturn that. That societies, cultures that have that kind of view of history, there have been many of them, not just the biblical world, but been many cultures that view the world that way. I would suggest that they view it that way because that's what's really happening. But what the anthropologists have discovered is that every society that views the timeline of events in that way always believes that they're living toward the end of it, toward the bad end of it. Almost none of them believe, oh yeah, we're still very close to when things were almost perfect. Nobody believes that. Everybody believes things are so bad, it's hard to imagine they can get any worse. And I've mentioned to you before the statement by Martin Luther that if Jesus does not come back in my lifetime, he must come back very soon because human beings have become so corrupted, it is impossible to imagine that things could get any worse. Well, that was 500 years ago. Can you think of anything about just Western society that's worse than it was 500 years ago? I don't even have to try hard. We probably can't drive home without seeing something. Yeah, that's worse than it was 500 years ago. And so, while I can see this description of the measuring of the temple as being relevant to the church age, I just have a hard time nailing down a specific time during the church age when I could say, oh yeah, that's what this is, because it just seems to fit the experience of believers all through the history of the church. That we are protected by God, but we are surrounded by a hostile world that wants to destroy us. And so, it's not that I don't think the historicist position has any validity here, it's just I have a hard time nailing down a specific time. The futurist. The futurist was the next alternative. The futurist position sees everything described in the book of Revelation, at least after the beginning of chapter 4. From chapter 4 on, everything in Revelation happens in the future, at least as far as John is concerned, and perhaps still as far as we are concerned. And so if we take this from the futurist position, generally speaking, a futurist would take the descriptions as literally as possible. A futurist would tend to take the descriptions as literally as possible, and therefore the description here would refer to a literal temple, a building, constructed presumably with stone, with courtyards around it. We are not actually told here what city it's in. I think we all just assume that it's Jerusalem because from a Jewish perspective, when you say the temple, you automatically assume it's Jerusalem. So a temple constructed in Jerusalem, and that there would be some attack on the city of Jerusalem, much like in the days of the Romans, only, unlike in the times of the Romans, a group of faithful believers would be within that inner section of the temple, the court of Israel, the court of women, the court of priests, Holy of Holies, the holy place, etc. A group of faithful believers would be within that part of the temple, but beyond that fortified wall surrounding it would be a hostile enemy, a literal army coming through and trampling that, having occupied that, and so these believers would then be surrounded. I have no way to rule that out. I have no way to say, well, that can't possibly be true, because that could be true. So I can't deny that that is a possibility. But my question is, how is that relevant to the people to whom John sent this book? John is given this vision and told to write down the vision and send it to the people in the 7 churches. Among those 7 churches was the church in Pergamum, where you are faithful even though you live where Satan's throne is. And you have been faithful even in spite of the death of Antipas, my faithful witness. In spite of what you're going through, I want you to be encouraged, and here's the message. And he sends them this vision. If we read everything in Revelation as being futurist, and most futurists would see the description of Revelation as still being future for us, that they have not yet happened, I don't understand how that provides any real comfort and encouragement to the believers in Pergamum or Sardis or Philadelphia or any of those cities. Imagine, because it has been and will be in the news a whole lot, imagine you were one of the people in Benghazi, at that annex building in Benghazi, and the enemy has you surrounded. And you get a text message from the outside that says, "We have good news for you. 200 years from now, ISIS and Al-Qaeda will be gone." What is your response? Okay. And what am I supposed to do with that information?
Well, Richard, it isn't supposedly our faith. Is our faith supposed to be sufficient regardless? I mean, if we didn't have our faith, that in the end, things are going to work out, would that not be something to cling to have it daily, to faith
And
in
ultimately,
life?
yes, and ultimately I think that is the answer. But I'm not exactly sure how telling people in Pergamum, for example, that 2,000 years from now, the temple will be rebuilt, and the enemy is going to attack it, but there will be a faithful core that are still protected in the center of the temple. If I'm in Pergamum and I get that message, and that's what that message means, I'm really not sure how that specific information, how those details really help me. The general idea of God, He will protect His people, yes, that's extremely important. Trust God, that's extremely important. The specific details, if this is a futurist vision, I don't know how those specific details really matter to me. And so that's my hesitation to interpret it in a futuristic sense. John?
I've heard you say before that the immediate audience of the writer of the book in the Bible is the context you want to look at, focus on. And you said the 7 cities, or churches, I should say, should be able to understand this from their perspective. And it only makes sense to interpret it accordingly. But I kind of think that this kind of prophecy, which, a lot of which is so supernatural and weird, is no more understandable to them as it is to us today. And I think we hamstring ourselves by saying it's got to be relatable to the 7 churches, or it can't apply.
But the earliest believers did think it meant something to them. And in the discussions we have from the earliest church about the book of Revelation, they did think it meant something to them.
Well,
They didn't really sit around saying, boy, this is weird, we don't know what to do with it, let's just stick it in the Bible and hope somebody someday understands it. That's not what they said.
Okay,
Um,
all ears.
Did not they put a lot of emphasis on their families continuing through history, continuing in their future? And that would be, okay, we're gonna continue. We're gonna be, or maybe not me, but
Uh-huh.
my grandchildren, great, are gonna be here around in many years from now.
Yeah, and so the idea that God will always protect his people, God will preserve his people, that's a valid message, that's an important message.
You'll be bringing somebody up.
But again, I'm not sure how the specific details of something that's gonna happen 2,000 years from now are critical to getting that message.
Go back to the Old Testament. All those prophecies that came true, that they can verify, that they can say, God said this, and 500 years later, it happened, et cetera, seems to say that God has said this, we can believe that this is gonna happen.
And remember I said, I can't say this is not going to happen
Yeah,
literally.
I understand.
So I have not said this will not happen as a futurist event. If you thought I said that, then I was unclear in what I said.
I'm just defending the futures.
Yeah. And I can't rule it out. I can't deny that that's going to happen. But my question, a question I always want to ask is, when the believers in those 7 churches read this, do they think this is a message from God? And I think the answer is yes.
I think it's futures like us right now.
The question is, what is the message from God?
Continue.
And I want to give the one last approach, the idealist. The idealist was the idea that events presented symbolically in Revelation reflect the ongoing conflict between good and evil that has been underway since Satan's rebellion and the fall, and that will continue until the return of Christ. And I think that idealist understanding of the description of the temple here would have been relevant to the people in the 7 churches. Again, not ruling out, not denying that something like this literally would, could, will happen in the future. But I think the symbolic understanding that God will protect his people. God's people will be attacked, but God will protect his people. I think that would have made sense to them. And understanding this passage, not specifically in those terms, but in terms similar to that, does seem to have been around in the early church. Now, before I get to those, I do want to read a piece of one commentary here. This is one that I think Ann mentioned a while, right when we were beginning this. The Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's a commentary by John Walford. And he says, let's see. Number of questions can be raised concerning this symbolic picture. Zechariah 2, a man is seen measuring Jerusalem, a scene which evidently portrays God's divine judgment on the city. Another instance is found in Ezekiel 40, where the temple of the future kingdom is carefully measured with a reed. Still another instance is Revelation 21, where the New Jerusalem is measured. The act of measuring seems to signify that the area belongs to God in some special way. It is an evaluation of his property. The temple here is apparently that which will be in existence during the Great Tribulation, originally constructed for the worship of the Jews and the renewal of their ancient sacrifices. During the Great Tribulation, it is desecrated and becomes the home of an idol of the world ruler, and he goes on. And so Walford is interpreting it in a futuristic sense. And so that is an interpretation. But I said in the early church, as far back as we can go, we don't seem to have instances of people throwing up their hands and saying, I really don't have any idea what this is all about. We have them making sense of it. The first of these commentary, these two books have a collection of very old commentaries on Revelation. The first one is by a man named Victorinus, and he lived in the 200s to 300s, somewhere in that time frame, 200s to 300s. And let's see. Find where he discusses this. Thought I had it marked, maybe, yes. Okay, this is Victorinus' discussion. And he received a measuring rod like a staff, that he might measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. In this passage, he speaks of that authority that John afterward exercised in the churches after his release, for he later also wrote a gospel. And when Valentinus and Corinthus and Ebion and other sects of Satan had spread throughout the world, bishops from neighboring cities gathered to him and persuaded him to write his testimony concerning the Lord. The measure of the faith, however, is the commandment of our Lord, namely that we must confess the Father Almighty as we have been taught. And so Victorinus is actually applying it, saying this is a reference to the fact that while there are heresies being spread around, there's false teaching being spread around, that John was commissioned to write the gospel, and that's this measuring of the inner court. And so that's Victorinus' interpretation. That's not my interpretation, but that is Victorinus' interpretation. The second of these commentaries is by someone named Caesarius of Arles, and he lived in the 500s, and Caesarius of Arles says, Then I was given a measuring rod similar to a staff, and the angel said, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. When the angel says rise, he is rousing the church for action, for John did not hear these things while sitting down. Measure the temple and the altar and those who worship in it. He is ordering the church to be placed under review and prepared for the end time, and those who worship in it. However, not everyone who seems to be worshiping is in fact a true worshiper. And for this reason, it says the court that is outside the temple, leave that out and do not measure it. Those persons are the court who appear to be in the church, but are really outside of it, whether they are heretics or Catholic Christians whose lives are evil, and Catholic with a little c, not Roman Catholic. For it is given over the nations, they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And he goes on talking about the two witnesses. And I could go through several more of these. I've got another one by Venerable Bede, and one by Ecumenius and Andrew of Caesarea. All of them in the early centuries of the church. And none of them interprets it as a literal temple building. They all interpret it. None of them throws up their hands and say, boy, we can't make any sense of this. But none of them interprets it as a literal building. What they all do is, in one way or another, see it as somehow symbolic of the people of God. That it is describing the people of God. And so then I would, well, my interpretation, the interpretation that I think is most likely is that this is a description of the people of God as we live in this world. That we are simultaneously protected and preserved by God. We are under God's protection and care. That God loves us, and God protects us, and God preserves us, and God will do so eternally. However, as we live faithful Christian lives in this world, we will encounter opposition, and sometimes fierce opposition from the world. Mockery and ridicule, and sometimes absolute violence from the world. There is a, I've kept this page semi-open on a web browser for a long time, and hopefully it will still come up. An Egyptian photographer finds family members who are happy that loved ones have become martyrs. This is a National Geographic Commission photographer who went into the Egyptian village where all of the men were from that were beheaded by ISIS quite a while back now. Photographer Jonathan Rashad arrived in the dusty Egyptian town of Al-Awur 2 days after 13 of its residents were shown being beheaded in a video released by the Islamic State. The town's victims were among the 21 Coptic Christians whom ISIS says it beheaded after kidnapping them from migrant worker dormitories in Libya. Rashad, a 23-year-old Egyptian documentary photographer, had come to the heavily Coptic Al-Awur, south of Cairo, to shoot portraits of grieving family members. What he found surprised him. National Geographic spoke with Rashad by telephone. News outlets had already spread the news that the beheading video, and wire services had covered the funerals. Why did you feel this project was necessary? Everyone was covering the funerals. I wanted to cover what had happened after the funerals. The funerals are a moment. I wanted to show the new reality that these deaths brought to their families. Were you scared? I was hesitant to take out my camera. It was a village mostly of farmers and construction workers, very traditional, pretty much countryside, with handmade houses, chickens, dirt roads. You arrived 2 days after the beheading video was released. How did you navigate the raw emotions? It's the difference between taking pictures and asking for pictures. I didn't start by knocking on doors and intruding. I wanted very much not to be rude. I talked with priests, pastors, whatever. A priest hooked me up with a kid, like 14 years old, who knew all the families. He was the nephew of one of the victims. I would go to their homes with this kid, and we would talk for hours so that they would know that I was there for a story and not just for a photo. You think your own youth helped too? Maybe, but I have a Christian name. They're not sectarian, but I think that helped. On the one hand, the subject of these portraits are vulnerable and sort of candid, but on the other, they are posed and the result of long discussions. Talk about your process with the subjects. The most important thing was to respect them as human beings. You don't want to be creepy. I didn't want to do a superficial story. I talked for hours and hours. I was there for 2 days. Many of the families said no. At least 4 or 5 times I got a no. And I left. A few days later, I came back. They knew I was serious. What surprised you most? I would expect people would feel very angry and calling for hatred and revenge and attacks, but many of them were very happy. They said their sons and brothers and husbands were martyrs now. They were the sons of Jesus. God had used them to spread the knowledge of Christianity like sacrifices. One of the mothers was laughing all the time and telling jokes. There's more to it. I'm not going to, there's a little bit more. What kinds of pressure did you feel in doing this project, political, religious, professional? Pressure is healthy. The more pressure, the more dedication. On a personal level, I feel very happy and proud. But on a professional level, as a journalist, the work is not over. You never know what's going to happen next. To me, I'm going to read that paragraph to you again. I would expect people would feel very angry and calling for hatred and revenge and attacks, but many of them were very happy. They said their sons and brothers and husbands were martyrs now. They were the sons of Jesus. God has used them to spread knowledge of Christianity like sacrifices. One of the mothers was laughing all the time and telling jokes. How do you do that? How do you respond in that way? How do you watch on video your loved one having his head cut off and then turn around and respond like that? What's the answer?
She knows where he is.
Yes.
They know that even though their bodies have been slaughtered, what else is true?
Their spirit is now.
They are in the presence of God. God is protecting them. They are enfolded in the arms of God. How long will these earthly trials last? Are these earthly trials going to last forever? And I think that's part of how they would have understood the 42 months. 42 months is a while. It's not just a moment, it's a while. But 42 months is not forever. And I pointed out last time, we have the 42 months here, we have 1,260 days for the two witnesses, and then later on we have two more 3.5-year periods. 1,260 days shows up again, and I think another 42 months shows up again. And so that, I don't know of anybody who takes that as referring to a 14-year tribulation. And so whatever you do with those 4 sets of 3.5-year time periods, if you don't think it's 14 years, you have to overlap them somehow. And you have to say, okay, this is not a literal 3.5 years followed by another literal 3.5 years, followed by another 3.5 years, followed by another 3.5 years, that at least 2 of these are the same thing. In some way they're describing the same thing. What does the number 7 mean in biblical symbolism?
Perfection.
Perfection, wholeness, completeness. Well, if 7 is whole, well, half of that, it's not complete, it's not whole, it's not going to last forever. And I think that's, given the way it is interpreted by these people that are writing these early commentaries, seeing it as a reference, understanding it, applying it in their situation as a reference to the people of God, it is a way of saying that, yet we may be trampled, but this is not going to last forever, and we're being protected and preserved by God. And the image of the temple and the outer courts, I did mention quite a while ago now. What is that outer court? If they think of it as the temple in Jerusalem, what is that outer court? That's the court of the Gentiles. And what happens in the court of the Gentiles? That is where the people of God, who are entitled to be in the central part of the temple, that's where they interact with those outside. That's where they interact with the Gentiles. That's where the mission of the church takes place. That understood the way I'm understanding it, it has an application of, as we carry out the mission that God has given us, we will encounter hostility. And we will encounter dangerous situations. And some of us will be like the 21 Egyptian men who were beheaded. But those men were not defeated. I don't ever refer to Jesus as being the victim of crucifixion. Jesus was not a victim. To say he was a victim means somebody did something to him that he couldn't prevent. Jesus was not a victim, and his crucifixion was not a defeat. What was the crucifixion? It was a victory. Jesus defeated death through the crucifixion. And in the same way, when the people of God stand face to face with the hostility of this world, and we refuse to bow down to the forces of this world, even if they cut our heads off, who wins? We did. And I think that's at least part of what is being said by this description of the courtyards here. Now, how does that relate to the 2 witnesses? Well, I'm already 6 minutes over time. And so we'll save that for next week. Again, I am not saying this cannot possibly have anything to do with some future literal temple. And in the same way that, going back to Ann's comment about the prophecies of the Old Testament, I think every one of those prophecies of the Old Testament had an application immediately in the lives of the people to whom it was spoken. And over time, I think maybe they discovered that it meant more. The people of God have discovered it meant more than maybe the original listeners understood and appreciated. But I do think it meant something in the lives of the people who heard Isaiah say those things. Well, I think this had a meaning for the lives of the people who first read it. And I think it has meaning for us. And the meaning for us is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if you don't know why I made that comment, then you could have been in church this time. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for your promises that the future is always in your hands. And that you will do surprising things, things that will amaze us and stun us, and then we will look back at Scripture and we will discover that we should have known it all along, or it was right there in front of us. But in the meantime, I thank you for the encouragement that we can face the forces of this world and be unbound before them. For the only power before which we will bow is you, in worship. And when we worship you, no power on this earth can defeat us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.